Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Turvey. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this Canadian Journalism Foundation's J Talks live event, The News Explainer Explained. Thank you for joining us today, and a special welcome to the journalism class with us from Centennial College, who I understand from their professor, Mary Vallis, are working on their own news explainers. You came to the right place. We know you're in for a masterclass on the art of innovative and impartial storytelling. The CJF is grateful to our exclusive J Talk series sponsor, TD Bank Group, for making these conversations about the future of journalism possible, and our thanks to our in-kind supporter, Cision. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to recognize the importance of the land that we each call home. The Canadian Journalism Foundation's office is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and we are privileged to live and work in these territories. A reminder that our discussion today is 45 minutes long, and you can still send in your questions at any time using the tab on your screen. And if you'd like to tweet about today's conversation, our hashtag is CJFJTalks. The 2022 Reuters Digital News Report found among its key global trends a declining trust in the media. Canada saw an all-time low last year and a rise in news avoidance. The study found that a proportion of people surveyed say they avoid news because it can be hard to follow or understand, which can leave readers feeling less informed or empowered. And if you couple that with the sheer volume of information coming at all of us every day across multiple platforms, it can be difficult for audiences to judge what is out there. That brings us to today's guest. Ros Atkins has pioneered a winning formula for providing audiences with smart, accessible journalism through his short, impartial, viral news explainer videos viewed by millions of people the world over. We are delighted to have Ros join us today from London, where he is the BBC News Analysis Editor. He is also the creator and presenter of Outside Source on BBC World News, and of course, Ros Atkins on Video Explainer series. Ros has been a BBC News radio and TV presenter for close to 20 years and has covered many of the biggest stories around the world. And if you are looking for an even deeper dive into explainers, his first book, The Art of Explanation, will be out this year in September. Leading our conversation today is CBC award-winning journalist Andrew Chang, who just launched an original series for CBC News Explore, About That with Andrew Chang, where he finds the awesome in daily news and unpacks newsworthy issues for viewers. A fixture for Canadian news audiences, Andrew hosted CBC's The National and spent a successful decade with CBC Montreal. We are honored to have Ros and Andrew with us today for the CJF conversation. To get started, Andrew, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much for that, for such a generous introduction. And Ros, man, so this is going to be fun. This is going to be a great chat. Can I just say on a professional note, but also on a personal note, I'm so looking forward to this chat because, as was just mentioned, our show About That is pretty new and one of the great sources of inspiration for us, because we're essentially an explainer show, was you and your work. So hello,
that's
how are
very
you doing?
kind. Hey, I'm very good. Lovely to see you. Thanks for that very generous introduction. Thanks to Natalie too. I'm thrilled to be with you, and if I can answer any of the questions you have, of course I'll do my best.
Well, hey, let's get right to it. And, it's sort of the cardinal rule, show, don't tell, right? And so we've got a little clip that we're going to show the audience right now. And this is just an excerpt of an explainer that you did that was one of, your most successful, if I'm not mistaken, right? Like sort of millions of views. It was about Partygate. So that scandal that broke, it was late in the end of 2021, about the holiday season of the previous year, at a time when there were sort of very strict restrictions against social gatherings in the UK due to the pandemic. But it came out that, of course, then PM Boris Johnson and his staff held a number of parties at 10 Downing Street. So let's go ahead and just watch this excerpt. Here it is.
In December last year, COVID cases were rising, restrictions were being tightened and Christmas plans were being changed. On the 16th of December, Boris Johnson made this plea.
This Christmas, it's vital that everyone exercises the greatest possible personal responsibility.
Also on the 16th of December, London went into Tier 3 restrictions. This meant no person may participate in a gathering unless it was reasonably necessary for work. On the 18th of December, Boris Johnson tweeted, "If you're forming a Christmas bubble, it's vital that from today you minimise contact with people from outside your household. Everyone must take personal responsibility," we were advised. Hours after that tweet was posted, in the evening of the 18th, there was a Christmas party in number 10. We know about it because the Daily Mirror reported how officials knocked back glasses of wine during a Christmas quiz and a secret Santa. The morning after, Mr. Johnson made this announcement.
It is with a very heavy heart, I must tell you, we cannot continue with Christmas as planned.
Millions of Christmas gatherings had to be cancelled, less than 24 hours after Downing Street had had a gathering of its own. And while the Prime Minister maintains this didn't break the rules, he's offered no evidence to explain why.
Okay, so Ros, pull back the curtain a little bit and tell me what were the conversations like, even just when you were contemplating doing that particular piece, the conversations with between you and your team?
So the first conversation is always, shall we do an explainer? Because there are lots of stories which the BBC would cover that sometimes we would cover that we wouldn't necessarily want to make a video on. And my first question is always, why am I making this video? Because there's an awful lot of content out there. And so if we're going to make the effort to make some more content, we need to be convinced it can serve a purpose. On this case, we felt that it was useful for us to put together a timeline that juxtaposed the different statements that occurred at the time, along with what we were learning about what had happened at the time as well. We also thought it was useful to juxtapose and remind people what the rules were at different points, because, and I'm sure it was the same in Canada, there were lots of different COVID rule changes during the pandemic. And as such, 12 months or more afterwards, quite reasonably, the viewers may have not have a perfect memory of what was the rule and when. Once we decided to construct that, the first thing we always do with our explainers is to collect the most important material. So we create a document, and into that document we place any material that we think may be relevant. That could be a clip, that could be a fact, that could be a line from regulations, that could be a report from other journalists, that could be a statistic, it could be anything, frankly. And we start placing them all in one place. And my job is to start thinking, how are we going to order these into a story that people will want to listen to and will want to follow? We don't always do this, but in the case of that explainer, we went for what I'd call a chronological treatment, where we walked through the chronology of those few days before that particular Christmas. And the act of walking it through was effective in telling the story. So while the producers are busy collecting and honing all the different elements of the story, my job is to think about the ordering of those elements and how I'm going to talk around them. Once we've done that process, well, then we'd bring our more senior editors in, and I would want them to see every word of my script to be clear that I'm being fair and accurate throughout. And I do that on every explainer I do. We don't just make it as a team. It would be looked at by normally one, but sometimes 2, 3, or even 4 senior eyes, depending on the subject. We don't take any chances at all with it. And we're not just looking to check if we're being factually correct. We're looking to make sure we've been fair to any person or people that we might be referencing in that report. Once we've done that, we would then get onto set and we would record the video. Sometimes we'll do it in one take. Sometimes there'll be a little bit of post-production, but not very much, frankly, because we want to get it out. We would then again show the complete video to an editor to make sure they're happy that it works in its entirety. And then once we've got it, we would push it out on our digital channels, regardless of whether it had been on the TV yet or not. So we wouldn't wait for my show to come around. If it was ready half an hour before the show went on air, we'd put it out then. If it wasn't ready till just afterwards, we would put it out then. And that's the beginning of the process, because of course, once you place an explainer in the digital arena, lots of people are going to have views on it. They're going to want to communicate with you. And as much as possible, I try and stay present in that discussion, because I don't think you can just lob an explainer into the digital world and then disappear. And as such, I hope the people who consume my videos, whether they like them or not, will feel that I'm available to hear what they've got to say.
So, Ros, as with any good answer, you've raised a million more questions. So let me try to work my way through them. I mean, you talk about the length of the process. If I could actually just ask you quickly, so in terms of the depth of the preparation and the research, the care that goes into the construction and the writing and the thoughtfulness of the delivery, like for a project like that one, an explainer like that one, how long did that take you to put together?
So I think we did that one in about 4 or 5 hours,
Wow.
working at a very intense level for 4 or 5 hours, because one of the things that I'm trying to do, and we don't always manage it, but certainly this is what I'm trying to do, is to provide the audience with depth and context and analysis at the point at which they want it most. And so sometimes I'm not making features. I'm not saying, hey, here's an interesting issue in the news that you aren't particularly thinking about, but I think you ought to be. I'm not, by the way, criticizing journalists who do that. But what I'm trying to do is say, there's a story in the news that you're all really interested in, but you may have some questions about it. So here's a video that may help. And so timing of a video is absolutely crucial to making sure it arrives when people want it most. And in the case of that story was moving quickly. There was no way we could have made that video the next day. And so when we decided to make it, which I think was around lunchtime, we knew, because we only had a certain window in the studio, that we had to record it between about 5:30 and 7 in the evening, or that was that. And so we were flat out. There will be other videos where we go in even greater depth on a broader issue. For example, we did a long explainer about the Russian accusations of there being Nazis in Ukraine and how those accusations aren't accurate. That was something we worked on for 3 days. And so it would vary according to subject, but some of our most successful explainers have been on stories which have arrived, and the audience appetite to have an explanation of what that story was about is enormous. And in those moments, you almost always have to get the explainer out on that day. And so we almost have, it's almost like we have a go decision, in that we wouldn't do that every day, but we'll have a kind of conversation amongst ourselves and we say, are we doing this? Are we going for this? And then if we are going for it, then everyone is totally committed for several hours to try and make it happen.
Bring me inside the conversation that you would have with your team when it comes to topic selection, because this clearly is one of the most important building blocks when it comes to building a good explainer. So how is it exactly that you gauge what you think your audience's interest level will be in a given topic, and how required it will be to have a succinct explainer of the variety that you think you can provide?
So Andrew, I'd say this is a mixture of art and science. You can't just root your decisions in numbers. No part of journalism can be. There's always judgment in there as well. But we have data, of course, on the stories that are being most heavily consumed through the BBC News website and app. We can also track how people are consuming stories, not just from the BBC, but from others on social media. Twitter is useful for that, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. We can also, for example, see how stories are performing on YouTube. And quite often our colleagues who run the BBC News YouTube channel will say this story is generating a lot of search at the moment, even though it's not in the mainstream news agenda. And so that can influence our decision. I remember we did an explainer which did quite big numbers about the arguments over the Nile and between Egypt and Ethiopia, and a dam that Ethiopia was building. I hadn't spotted it, but my colleagues who run the BBC News YouTube channel said there's a huge amount of interest in this, and so we made an explainer off the back of that advice. So we've got some data that's flying around, and we use that, and we're certainly guided by that. But there's a second question. I'm slightly repeating myself, but it's worth saying. I'll also look around and see what else the BBC is making and what else other people are making, because I come back to the point that if we're all to make the effort to make the explainer, I need to feel I'm adding something, that it's worth me doing it, not just because it would be a waste of the BBC's resources, but also, frankly, why would I ask someone to watch something if they could already easily get that information elsewhere? And so we're really strict on that. Why are we doing this? What are we adding? We're asking that constantly every time. And sometimes we'll start work on one and we'll pull back from doing it because we're just not convinced we have enough to say. So we've got some data. We're making some judgments about what other output there is out there. And then the third thing, and frankly, I think this is more instinct than anything else. Sometimes I'm looking at the news and I'm looking at how people are conversing about the news on social media, and you can just pick up on a level of sometimes confusion or sometimes it's simply appetite for more. People are really interested in a subject, but they're confused by that subject. And so I did a recent explainer about the extended waiting times in parts of the health service in England at the moment. It's affecting almost everyone in one way or the other. And a lot of people are confused as to why that's happening now. And so we made an explainer to try and help answer those questions, which leads me to a final point, which is I need to be convinced that it's useful. I'm obsessed with our explainers being useful, being helpful. And that is often one of the big clinchers. If I feel like if I made this, I think it would help people navigate a story they're already interested in. That's a big reason to make it.
So clearly you've given this a lot of thought, but let me ask you this. Is there a topic or a topic area perhaps that has surprised you in the way in which it has gone viral, either because you didn't expect it to, or that it caught you off guard in terms of how needed or wanted it was?
So one of the things so there's two things. I'll answer that in two ways. One is that as news journalists, or certainly generalists as I am, we tend to operate within reasonably classic editorial boundaries, politics, big natural disasters such as the story this week, and so on. We don't tend to venture outside of that very often, but we've had huge success doing sports stories. And I don't mean doing sports stories in terms of who should be playing in defense for Liverpool and Manchester United, but we've done when Novak Djokovic had all those difficulties with his visa going into Australia 12 months ago. We did 3 consecutive explainers on that, which did huge numbers. When Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen had that very strange end to the Formula One season 2 years back, we did an explainer on that, which got close to 1 million. So sometimes we will actively venture outside of stories that we might more traditionally cover. So that's one thing that's been surprising. And one thing we found is that you enter an entirely different information ecosystem, one where you aren't normally. I did an explainer about the Live Golf Tour, which is challenging the PGA and the European Golf Tour. We did a 7-8 minute explainer on that, and it did close to 2 million views. Now, I would never have imagined I could have done a 7-minute news explainer on golf and it would do 2 million views, but actually we ended up in a different part of social media, golf social media, sports social media, where we don't normally venture. And suddenly lots of people were discovering what we were doing because we'd come to them rather than expecting them to come to us. So that's been really interesting. The other thing that was one of the reasons I started doing these explainers was I was convinced people wanted more detail. I was convinced that we'd drawn the wrong conclusion at some point during the digital revolution that journalism's going for, that somehow everything needed to be short, everything needed to be simplified. I was convinced it needed to be consumable and helpful, but I wasn't convinced it needed to be short, and I wasn't convinced it needed to be light on detail. And one that really taught me that was, I forget how long back this is, maybe 18 months, and it's a story all of you watching will know very well. The North America heat waves, which of course terribly affected some parts of Canada and some parts of the western coast of the US. We did a really long explainer connecting the experiences of individual places we started in Canada as our first focus, but we widened and widened and widened the story until by the end of the video, it was about what's happening to the climate as a whole. And I would never have imagined that type of treatment, that level of detail would do I think it got close to 1 million views on Twitter, which is, by any standards, pretty big. And so one of the other lessons that we've learned and that we've been surprised by is that if you tell the story well enough, and if you choose the subject well enough, and if you time the release of the video well enough, people will really consume a lot of what you have to say. All those previous steps, of course, I don't assume we're going to get right, but if you can get them right, that rule that somehow got stuck in a lot of newsrooms' minds 10 years ago or so, that if you give people too much detail, it's a turn-off. One of the things that's been most gratifying of the last 3 years has been to be shown an enormous amount of proof that's not true.
Well, okay, so let's underline this point, because at the same time, there must still be something, a magic number that's either too short or too long. And there's a question here that we have, and I'll try to weave in these audience questions as we get them, because there are a lot of them and they're excellent. So this is Lee asking, explainer videos are short. But is there an ideal length? Like, is there such a thing as too short or too long?
Hi, Lee. Thanks for the question. I don't think I'm going to dodge it. I don't think there is a correct length. The choice that I would say is useful to think about is what information. So let's imagine you've set out what you want to explain. What information is essential to explaining that? What information without which you couldn't do it? You could not do it properly. You wouldn't serve your audience. What information is interesting? What information is diverting? What information makes you think, okay, I'm glad I knew that? And I'm quite strict about stripping out that second category. I'm interested in what you really need to know. I'm not interested so much in what is interesting to know, not because I've got anything against that information, just because that's not necessarily going to help with the efficiency with which I deliver the core explanation. And so for me, that's the key test. And if the essential information comes in at 2.5 minutes, that's how long it is. If the essential information comes in at 9 minutes, that's how long it is. And one of the best techniques, Lee, I use to do this is when I'm looking at an explanation, I'm trying to make certain points that are building up to the fundamental point that I'm trying to get across. Sometimes you can spot that within your explanations, you're trying to make a single point, but you're attaching 4 bits of information to make that point. Sometimes you can lose 2 or 3 of those bits of information, and you can just say, this is the point, here's the evidence that supports it, and then move on to the next point that you want to make. And that is a very good technique to reduce the length of what you're making without reducing the fundamental content of it. But if you're asking, do I go in and say to my team, it's got to be 3 minutes or else, we don't have those rules.
You know, I will say, having watched a number of your explainers, Ros, that there is, to your point that you've just made, a sort of brutal efficiency with which you build a case throughout your explainer from start to finish, and that's always sort of a joy to watch. You know, there's another question here from one of our guests from Centennial College. I apologize, I don't have a name attached to this, but it's a great question. Hang on here, let me pull this up. So, how do you ensure your explainers are not too simplistic and actually meet the audience's needs? And knowing your audience, I mean, that's actually a pretty tough question to answer, right?
So that's a tough question. Hi to all of you watching in Centennial College. So I'm a generalist, and I'm making explainers for all of the BBC's audiences in the UK and around the world. And so that is a broad audience. And so it's not possible for me to say, hey, I'm just making my explainers for this section of society or people of this age. I can't say that because it's not true. So the thing that I have in mind when I'm making my explainers is someone who is interested in the news or interested in this issue and would like to know more. And that can mean any type of person of any age and of any background. They're going to need to initially be interested in the story. I'm not doing a cold sell on them. I'm expecting them to have some awareness of the story, but would like some help understanding that story better. So that's the person I have in mind. In terms of how much nuance is, you know, to gauge nuance, I would come back to this, which is it's the essential versus interesting divide. I don't mean to sound like a stuck record, but if there is a nuance without which you are not really giving a fair or accurate representation of the issue, the nuance needs to go in. If actually the nuance, your desire to keep the nuance in is actually evidence that you haven't worked through the issue sufficiently that you can express it more clearly, well, that's a clue that actually you've still got work to do. So I've just come from doing an explainer with my 2 colleagues, Ellen and Mary, who are both exceptional. And I've worked with Mary on these for a good couple of years now. And Mary is particularly good at this. I will say, look, I think we need this nuance in there. I think without this detail, we can't do it. And Mary will say, we need to spend another 20 minutes on this. And that's code for we haven't really understood the issue well enough. And if you come at it again and again, in the end, you'll get yourself to a point of clarity where you perhaps can lose the nuances because you've seen the issue more clearly. So some nuance does need to stay in. Some nuance is evidence of needing to do further work to understand it. And if that all sounds quite difficult, it is, which is why I'm constantly seeking second opinions. So I'm constantly ringing up colleagues or friends or anyone who's got expertise in the area saying, if I said it like this, would that be okay? Or do I need to put this in? Or if I took that out, would that be reasonable? And so I'm seeking advice all the time, because needless to say, these explainers aren't just a team endeavor amongst me and my immediate producers. They're a team endeavor because we lean on lots of different people with different expertise to make sure we get it right. But the key bit of advice is we do keep checking. Every video you watch of ours, we've had any number of conversations to say, is this the right level of nuance? Can we live with it? Can we live without it? And so we're constantly gauging that, because it's vital to making a good explainer.
It's a really tricky question, though, right? Because like the question of how much knowledge do you presuppose that your audience has about a given story, which of course colors the nuance and detail that you inject into the story. I did an explainer not too long ago, but although it was long enough ago that this was just before Russia invaded Ukraine, when tensions were still building along the border. And I remember my social media team at the time challenged me to put together a 60-second explainer explaining those tensions. And I had to really
How was that?
It wasn't easy because you have to go into the history, right? And you have to talk about the Soviet Union. You have to talk about the Western pressure of NATO. You have to talk about the internal pressures within Ukraine, the separatist movement. You have to talk about the cultural fabric that binds Ukraine and Russia and why that matters. But we did it. We did it in 60 seconds.
All right. Well, I'd like to see that. You'll have to send it to me.
Yeah, I will. But the challenge there, of course, was trying to figure out, okay, what does the audience need? How much can I assume they know about the history, and how much do I have to explain in the moment? And I still don't know if I've figured that question out, if I've cracked that nut.
Well, of course, there's no correct answer to that, Andrew. So I to some extent, we're all wrestling with that. For what it's worth, I err on the side of people not knowing, not because I'm passing judgment on them, but I work in the news. I do it every day, and yet there's still all sorts of details about news stories that I don't know. For me, the technique that I use is to acknowledge in my scripts that some people may know this, but others may not. So you may actually, I might actually say, as some of you may know, Manchester is a town in the north of England. That's just a small example. But of course, if you're in the UK, you don't need someone to tell you Manchester's in the north of England. But if you're in Canada, you might do. And so there are turns of phrase that we can use that both acknowledge both the people who know and the people who don't know. The other technique I use is to make sure that my explanation of the detail, which I feel I can't assume, is as efficient and crisp as possible. So if you're watching and you know what I'm saying, I'm through it in 5 seconds. So you're going to put up with that. If I take 45 seconds to explain something that you know full well, you might be out of there by that point. And so the test for me is, if there's a detail I feel I need to explain, then I'm going to explain it, but I'll try and do it efficiently. There's something else I'll add, Andrew. This is one of my favorite techniques. Really ask yourself whether you need to reference that detail. Could you do this explainer without specifically referencing that detail which requires explanation? Because for me, there's always two choices. Either you reference it and you explain it, or you take it out. The option in the middle, which is reference it and don't explain it, I'm not willing to do that, because for me, that's not showing sufficient respect to the people who are maybe watching the video. And so that is a really interesting choice. But if you push yourself and really ask yourself, sometimes you'll find that you are including detail that you could live without. And if you can identify that, then you save yourself both including the detail and having to explain it. And before you know it, you've got 15 seconds to play with.
And I guess when you're talking about detail on that level, that can encompass almost everything, right? Everything from names, numbers, dates.
I'm constantly removing names, in particular, names, job titles, long descriptions of organizations which perhaps no one's heard of before. I'm asking myself, does the viewer need to know all of this, or is there another way that I can include this and obviously show, sufficient attribution and respect for whoever I'm referencing, but is there a way that I can bring their comment in without cluttering my explanation with detail that doesn't need to be there? So, one example might be, you might say a senior official from the country's government, or a senior official, rather than saying their name, their extended job title, which department they're in, and how they sit with reference to the prime minister, because all of those details don't really matter. What you need to know is that someone very senior in the government has said this. And so there are sometimes techniques that you can use to strip out some detail. And by stripping out the detail, you strip out the need to further explain it. And both of those things create space.
It's funny. I'm constantly having to check my own scripts when I'm using a detail to explain a point, but a detail that, to your point, requires further explanation.
Right.
But sometimes it's more complicated than the point you were trying to make.
Exactly. And so the answer is not always finding a snappy way of explaining it. The answer is sometimes to take it out.
You've raised a few times, how efficient you need to be when you explain things. And when I think of your tone and your style and your delivery, and I ask this question because we've actually had a few questions about tone. So, I mean, I would describe, there are lots of words I could use to describe you, but
say what you think, Andrew, I don't mind.
No, but serious, clearly, when you're doing an explainer, but concise, right? And blunt, I would say, in a way as well. And I'm just curious, that is obviously an intentional, deliberate choice on your part. It has to be. But it's in a media climate where we see content that, I don't know, like is sort of increasingly driven by opinion, by, kind of style, by, having perspective and trying to inject personality. And I guess I'm just curious how you balance those things.
Well, you're right. My tone is quite deliberately consistent, and in most of my videos, my delivery is close to identical. This all roots back to 2019, when I was sitting in the summer of 2019 and kind of pondering, well, how do I, as an impartial journalist, how does the BBC as an impartial journalism organization compete with the biggest growth area in journalism, which is opinion? So opinion was becoming more and more dominant as a popular form of journalism, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, but that's not something I can compete in. BBC journalists can't express opinions, which is absolutely fine by me. I don't want to, but I was thinking, particularly in the digital arena, well, how do I compete? And my conclusion was that I needed to do a few things that I could do, and I needed to do them exceptionally well. So I needed to be as helpful as possible. People want help with the news. I was going to be as efficient as possible. So you give me a minute of your time and I'm going to give you a lot of information in return. So it feels to me like a good equation. I hope that whether you like what we do or not, that you couldn't quibble with how much I was giving you in a minute. And then the second thing I wanted to do was to see if, while still being impartial and fair, I could be more assertive and direct in asserting what we knew to be true. And this meant that with politicians and with other people who were involved in the news, I was having to be very direct about saying whether what they had said added up or not. And I wasn't doing this to score political points. That's not my motivation at all. My motivation is to help explain the news. But I was aware that there would be a risk that if I started doing this very bluntly, to use your word, or assertively to use mine, that perhaps this could be misinterpreted. Even if though I didn't want it to be, perhaps this could be misinterpreted. So as I sought to assert the potency of the facts within the story, I thought, well, the best way to remove any chance of misinterpretation is to simply let the facts and the words and the content do the work. And I'm not going to contribute to that. So I deliberately chose a tone which left the information I was passing on to be the star of the show, and I'm simply the conduit. And people seem to like that. And I think it also meant that they could take the information as clearly as I could communicate the information as clearly as would be possible. So it kind of worked, I think, in terms that it helped people understand what I was saying, but it also worked in that it made clear that all I was interested in was passing on the best information that I had, which is the case.
There are some great questions rolling in, so I'm going to try to get to some of these. This one's from Andrew, not me, but this is an audience question. A real nuts and bolts question. To create those explainer videos, is there a dedicated team tasked with making something every day? And what staffing roles are involved in bringing it to life on a consistent basis?
Thanks very much indeed for the question, Andrew. There is a dedicated team. There wasn't in the beginning. We started off as an experiment on my program Outside Source, and then they became so popular and the BBC was hoping I'd make more of them that they decided to staff them. So we started off with one dedicated producer. We now have 2 dedicated producers, although on occasion, sometimes 3 or even 4 could get involved, depending on the amount of research and production that would need to be involved. So it would be the producers who do the research, who do all the nuts and bolts, to use Andrew's phrase, of the production, from cutting all the clips to putting all the, creating all the graphics and all of those really difficult details. I can't take any credit for them. They do brilliant work. And then we run it through a TV gallery. So at the moment that we're recording it, so this isn't recorded and then edited after the event. Ideally, we would run it through a TV gallery, all the clips and the graphics, and then we might tidy it up after the event. But largely, it's in good shape. And of course, in the gallery is a director, someone helping with the auto cue, someone on the sound, all the people you would expect within a TV production. And really, that description takes you right back to the idea that I had, which was that here I was with the TV program, and I thought this is an incredible production resource. We could also use this to make digital video as well as live TV. Now, actually, as they've become more popular, we're heading towards it in a direction where we are now becoming separate from the live TV. And so we're heading in a direction where we will record it and then post-produce it in FCP or whichever editing system that we're using. There's one other thing I should say, Andrew, is really important. We have no commitment to producing a certain amount of videos every week. And the BBC's never asked for me to do that, and I've never wanted to do that. So if we don't have an idea we think that's worth making, we don't make it, or we'll start working on something else. Because one of the things that I try to do is make sure that when we arrive with an explainer, the audience thinks, oh, this might be worth watching, because when they arrive, they've got something to say. If you start making stuff that's just okay, then you risk, I think, eroding the reputation the product has. So we don't have a commitment to making them on a Monday or Wednesday. We might make 5 in a week. We might make none in a week.
Another great question from one of our guests from Centennial College. I love this question. How do you keep people's attention until the end of the video?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a vital one, right? Because you can have the best payoff in the world, but if people don't make it there, then that's a problem. So I'll give you 2 quick answers. I could give you a longer answer, but I'm aware time's ticking by. So I'll give you 2 quick answers. One is, watch out for the weaknesses in your explanation. Be ruthless about thinking, is this section essential? Is this section well written? Is this section holding my attention? I'll give you one quick anecdote. We were making a story just after the withdrawal from Afghanistan about how Trump's deal with the Taliban the year before had in some ways connected to what the US policy was at the time that they withdrew from Kabul. And we had a section in the middle of it which my colleague Andrew Bryson spotted. He said, I just don't think this is really working. And we toed and froed and toed and froed and toed and froed. And I was hanging on to it. And he was going, no, it's got to go. And he was right. And it was a weakness. And we took that section out and the video went viral. And I'm pretty sure if we'd kept it in, people would never have made it to the end. So that's one answer, is watch out for the weaknesses and be really harsh on yourself in judging if there's a weakness. The second is, think about how you move people from one element of your explanation to another. We tend to spend a lot of time thinking about, right, I want to explain X, which is part of the overall subject. I'm going to work on that. Now I'm going to work on Y. But how are you going to build momentum between X and Y, and then between Y and Z? And if you watch my videos, I use we call them back annos, back announcements a lot to help do this. So you come off one issue and you go, well, that's that. But to understand why that's important, you need to look at Y. So to understand why X is important, you need to look at Y. Or the government says X is a disgrace, but the opposition says it's this. So you're both referencing where you've come from and you're looking ahead to where you're going. And these kind of techniques can be very effective at building momentum, because in the end, the single most important thing you can do with an explainer is be telling a story people want to hear the end of. If you're just passing on useful information, that utility of information is probably not going to be enough to keep them going in the end. You have to combine being incredibly useful with telling a story. They want to know what's next, what's next. And so I hope when you're watching my videos, it's a bit like I've got a pack of cards, if you like, a pack of story cards, and I'm folding them out one by one. I'm going, so this has happened, and that's really important, but actually bear this in mind, but you won't know what happens next. There's this. And it's almost like I'm unpacking the story in front of you. You're thinking, what's next? What's next? What's next? That's the theory. I'm not saying I always manage it, but those are some ways that I try and keep people watching.
So that's wonderfully helpful. I love that insight. And I mean, the individual points matter, but it's the connective tissue, right, between them that can really drive
Yes,
a viewer home.
Absolutely.
So here's another great question, again, from one of our Centennial College guests. Do you have any tips for how to make complicated concepts easy to understand in video format? And when I think about that question, I mean, there are all kinds of tools, right? Like, I mean, you could use analogy and metaphor. You could try to use graphics, diagrams, I mean, whatever, what have you. What do you find is effective?
So thank you very much indeed for the question. So the first thing that I would recommend you do before you think about the excellent ideas that Andrew is suggesting is this is a step before it, which is you've just got to really understand it. And I know that might seem obvious, but if you're struggling to understand something complicated in a succinct way, it's probably because you just haven't understood it well enough. And sometimes we will spend a long time just coming at a story or an issue until we've seen it clearly. Once we've seen it clearly, then you can start taking the decisions that Andrew's describing, which are essential, which is, okay, I want to make this point. What's the most high impact way I can do that? All right, I'll show these pictures. Okay, I'll show this statistic. Okay, I'll show this quote. But before I start deciding what elements are going to go with my explanation, I want to have been sure that I know what I want to communicate, because those elements that Andrew is describing are supporting what I'm explaining. But I can't know what I want supported until I've worked out the basics of what I'm explaining. So I'll give you one example I'm right in the middle of. I'm making a half-hour documentary, which is essentially a grand explainer about the UK economy and the challenges within it. And it's fiendishly complicated, and I'm not a specialist economist. So obviously I know a little bit about it, but I'm not a specialist economist. We've been working on this. I mean, I've been working on it full time, so I don't want to exaggerate, but we've been working on this, thinking about this for 3 or 4 weeks. And I would say only in the last day or two am I starting to see it sufficiently clearly that I can really get a feel for what elements I want to use at what point in the explanation. That's an extreme example, but even if it's just within the course of a working day, don't short circuit the stage where you just make sure you've understood it. Because if you can get through that stage, everything else will follow, and you can take smart decisions about how to support your explanation and your understanding. If you rush to the graphics and the clips and the quotes and the social media and everything else you want to include, but you haven't actually really fundamentally understood it, then you're likely to get in a tangle later on.
Ros, I have time for one more question, and just allow me to say, so, you know, I consider you an inspiration to me, but it strikes me that you must be, by extension, inspired by other people. So here's a question from Samuel to wrap this up. Outside of your work, who is doing explainers the best, or is really good?
So that is a great question. There's a guy called Johnny Harris who used to be at Vox, who now is his own man and does very, very successful explainers on YouTube. I don't think I would make my explainers exactly like he does. That's not a criticism. He has a slightly different style, but I watch what he's up to with great interest, and he is showing you can make very long explainers. Some of his are 18, 19 minutes long and do huge numbers, particularly on YouTube. So I've been really impressed by the work that he's been doing. Vox itself, by the way, for 10 years has been, you know, exemplary in innovating around video explainers, and I've certainly looked at what they're up to. The New York Times, needless to say, does good work in that sphere too. I would actually say my number one inspiration isn't someone who makes video explainers. He's one of the BBC's most experienced correspondents. He's a guy called Alan Little. He's covered some of the biggest stories in the world for the last 30 years or more. And he has an approach to clarity and writing that helped me understand how to communicate complicated issues effectively and in a way that wanted you to hear the rest of it. And while video explainers in some ways are full of really exciting production, and I'm not dismissing them, by the way, we spend a lot of time thinking about them, at their core, they are about writing with incredible clarity about incredibly complicated things. And Alan Little did a training course that I found in the BBC archive the other day, well, a few years ago now, and it is incredible. And in it, he says, you are trying to say whatever it is you want to communicate with the simplest words, in the shortest sentences, in the most direct way that you can. And really, even though this explainer product is a new product, actually, it's rooted in the fundamentals of BBC journalism and lots of the most classic journalism, which is how can we communicate about our world in a way that makes sense for our audience. And so if I was to pick one inspiration, it's Alan, because really that discipline around writing underpins all of the more creative and digital dimensions to the work that I do.
Ros, this is the worst moment of my day because it's the moment I realize this conversation has to end.
Well, that's very kind.
This has been an absolute joy, wonderfully helpful, wonderfully insightful.
Thank you.
And you know, if the audience learned even half as much as I did, I think we're all in a good place. And thank you to the audience. Your questions were fascinating and amazing. This has been wonderful. Ros, thank you.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to all of you watching. Thanks for making time to listen to me. Andrew, thanks for hosting. Of course, thanks to everyone for inviting me. And I guess one thing that may have come across, but it's worth reiterating, is we didn't stumble across this format. We've spent a long time analyzing the real detail of what works. And to be absolutely clear, we frequently do things that don't work. And the lesson that I've learned and the discipline that I've learned is to watch who else is doing it well, learn from them, spot when we're doing things well and make sure we do it again, and also be conscious of when we're not doing things well and try and put it right. And that the discipline of constantly critiquing even the smallest details means that in the end, if you do all of those things in sync, if you become disciplined about all of these different dimensions of explanation, they add up to something more. Something clicks and you get something that is greater than the sum of its parts. It doesn't always happen, Andrew, but when it does, it's I guess it's why we all became journalists.
Well said. Thank you, Ros.
Thanks for making time. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.